Okay, cool. So, yeah, I've just done a video on why I think antinatalists should basically leave the red button thought experiment by the wayside when it comes to discussions on antinatalism. So, I've actually seen in the comments section of my video, whilst I haven't replied to every comment because that would just take so much time, I have seen that a lot of people have misunderstood what I've said. So, um, I'm not saying that the red button thought experiment doesn't have any use at all in any context, but I think I've seen it deployed in discussions around antinatalism, and I think one, it doesn't really add anything to the conversation on antinatalism, and I think two, it encourages confusion about what antinatalism is. And when I say that, I think it encourages a confusion between pro-mortalism and antinatalism. Um, and again, that's not to say that pro-mortalism is wrong per se. It's just saying it's different from antinatalism. Um, so just to summarize the main points that I made in that video, if I'm remembering correctly, are that the red button thought experiment, fundamentally why it's not about antinatalism, is because it asks the question of, would you be willing to end all lives to be able to achieve your desired outcome, right? Which to me is very different from what antinatalism is about. A second reason is that this red button thought experiment, it, I've only ever seen it being brought up in conversations around antinatalism, but it can be applied to anything. And I give some examples in the video, like of sex trafficking or slavery. I've never heard anyone talk to someone who's advocating against sex trafficking and said, oh well, would you go as far as to press a red button to achieve your aims or whatever. And then there are a few other things I said, like I proposed an alternative. I said I think it confuses antinatalism and pro-mortalism, and it confuses it for people who are trying to understand antinatalism. I think it gives people. I think it's unnecessarily inflammatory because it's asking someone if they would essentially sign off on genocide. Well, not genocide because that's a specific ethnic group, but I think the word is omnicide. When I really don't think you need to go that far when you're trying to understand how the other person thinks about antinatalism. But I think that is by and large what I spoke about. So yeah, we can just go from whatever you want to talk about, Tejas.
Okay, let's talk about red button. Now, no, thanks for this, Lawrence, and of course, thanks for the earlier video as well. Some of the things I thought was the main point was the red button is not useful, and the red button is counterproductive, and
Mm,
then the red button is not brought in other problems, and then finally, you also talked about some alternatives to red button.
yeah.
And I thought I should explore these 3 or 4 points. One part I want to explore is whether it is really not useful or not, and secondly, if that is an enough reason for us not to address red button.
Mm,
So, in terms of utility, you spoke about the red button doesn't really tell us anything about antinatalism itself,
mm,
because antinatalism is not about ending existing life, whereas red button is about, and all it can tell us is the convictions of antinatalist rather than the arguments for antinatalism.
yes.
Right, that was one. Now, a few points on that. One is that the red button tells you on the scale of all the ethical problems and ethics that one holds,
Mm,
where does one stand in terms of antinatalism? So, of course, I agree, it tells more about the antinatalist than antinatalism, but it still tells that about antinatalists, and that in itself, I think, isn't that valuable. Do you think?
So, do you mean it gives us information about where the antinatalist prioritizes antinatalism on the list of ethical issues that we should be addressing?
That plus it gives us an idea of the urgency that the antinatalist feels about this issue.
Right. So I think so. In answer to your question, yes, I think if the question that someone gives to the red button thought experiment will give you some information to those things, but it will also, you'd have to, I don't think it would give you it on a silver platter. You'd really have to ask further questions, because if someone says, for example, that they would press the red button because they're an antinatalist and they want to end all lives in pursuit of preventing any future births, um, that could tell you about the urgency, but you'd also have to ask further questions about, um, you know, uh, how do they view death, for example? Do they view death as a harm? Because if they don't view death as a harm, then it wouldn't really be that big a deal to them. Whereas if they view death as a harm, then it would be a massive deal for them to press the red button. So I think I agree with you that it would give and I even say this in the video, it doesn't tell you anything about the principles, but it tells you how far someone's willing to go for the principles. So I do say in the video that I agree with you here.
Okay.
But I think you would need to ask further questions to actually get a full answer to what you want to know.
Right, right. And that actually, it's good that you brought up death in that, because on an individual level, the equivalent question is, why don't you kill yourself
Mm,
if you don't want to start a new life?
yeah.
And the general response, or what we would recommend, is to answer that question, to face that question and answer it and say that it is not about ending existing life.
Mm,
So our response to that question seems to be different than our recommendation for red button. My point is, whether red button is good or not, whether we would press it or not, is a different
mm,
thing. But um, if you are facing the question of why don't you kill yourself, we are taking that up. We should also
mm,
take up the questions on a higher species level, or the human level, or the life level. You know what I mean?
mm. Yeah, so I guess this will depend on the person. So if someone posed both of those things to me, if they posed why don't you kill yourself and the red button, if someone directly asked me those, then I would answer their question. It's not like I would just say, no, I'm not talking about that, let's move on. The point of my video was that I don't think it's a useful thing for us to actively be bringing up. If someone asks you it directly, then, if you want to dodge the question, that's up to you. Or if you want to answer it, that's up to you. So that wasn't really what I was talking about in the video. But if someone asked me about, you know, why haven't I killed myself, and the red button, I think I would answer them in pretty much the same way. I would say the fact you're asking me that question means that you fundamentally misunderstand what antinatalism is about. Because just because I think that it would have been better never to have come into just because I think it would have been better never to have come into existence doesn't mean that I want to end my own life. Likewise, just because I think it's better to not to come into existence, it doesn't mean I want to end all lives, if you get what I mean. So I'd
Yeah.
answer them in pretty much the same way.
Right, right, right. I agree with you that we should not be bringing up actively in terms of, like, if you're having stop having kids campaign, you should not be actively going on
Yeah.
the street and say, I'm going to press red button without anybody asking you. That I agree. But when we are, like when an academic literature is being produced, or a book is being
Mm,
written, or even a serious video is being done. So one analogy I can think of is, in case of vegan or plant-based or animal rights scenarios, Stranded Island is a famous thought experiment.
mm.
You know that if you're stranded on, the experiment.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
But just for anybody who doesn't know, if you're stranded on an island with a pig and nothing else, would you
Mm,
eat that pig? Is an experiment put up by those who are defending eating meat.
mm,
And thought experiments usually try and evaluate your intuitions. Those are the tools to bring out your intuitions. I think Daniel Dennett said this. So there is an analogy there. Now,
mm.
I don't think when you're doing vegan outreach, you should rather put posters about stranded islands. But when you're writing about it, so for example, if I remember correctly, Tom Regan in his Animal Rights, The Case for Animal Rights,
Yes.
has this section about, he talks about the stranded island. If I remember rightly, I might be wrong.
Mm.
The point is, at in those places, should those red button experiments also be brought up, so that these intuitions could be evaluated, at least. Um,
Yeah, so I think if someone um, writes an article about the red button or something like that, um, I don't think antinatalists should necessarily ignore it. Like I said, if someone asks us about the red button, I think it's completely fine to give a response. The response I'd advise is, if someone asks you about the red button, I think the first thing you should say to them is, what information are you hoping to get out of my answer to this question? Because then that will enlighten you as to whether they've actually understood if it's relevant to antinatalism or if it's only relevant to your tolerance for ending the lives of others, right, to achieve your ethical ideals. So I think that's an important first thing to ask. Depending on their answer is then going to change how you obviously move forward with the conversation. But to talk about what you also said about, should we discuss the red button willingly and bring it up so that we can sort of test people's intuitions? I think this can be interesting in a. I think it depends what intuition. First of all, it depends what intuitions you're talking about. So I'm not sure it would give us any information about our intuitions that are relevant to antinatalism. Um, but I'm open to there being some. I might be wrong on this, which is why at the end of my video I said, look, if you disagree with me, put in the comments. Um, so yeah, I'm yet to kind of see what intuitions it would test that would be relevant to antinatalism rather than the individual person's propensity for ending lives. And the other thing is, I think if we do want to test our intuitions with the red button, it would probably be best to start by doing that in very private areas, um, and discussing it in private conversations and stuff like that until we're really sure that it actually has real value. Because if I mean, maybe the damage is already done, because like the red button has been spoken about ad nauseum online. I know many of those videos will have been taken down, but there will still be some up there. But I think a lot of the discussion around the red button that I've seen to date, and obviously I haven't seen all of it, has been what I view as quite sloppy. Like it's brought up because it's a catching sort of thought experiment. It sounds cool, and people like to ask it because they want to push things really far. And I can understand that because it's fun to do that sometimes. But often when I see it deployed in a conversation, I'm thinking, how is this actually relevant to the conversation, really? Um, so I think it can be fine to bring up if you want to test intuitions, as long as the intuitions are actually relevant to antinatalism, and also just be wary about what situation you're doing it in, and also think, are there any less controversial ways of testing those intuitions, like the alternatives I give in the video about comparing Earth to Mars and a button that removes suffering but doesn't commit you to killing everyone. So yeah.
So I think there are two or three routes why red button. I mean, we reach out to red button. One
Mm.
is that when we are talking about antinatalism, extinction is at least a theoretical consequence we have to face.
Yes. Yeah.
And whether you think it as a consequence, a tolerable consequence, or whether you think it as a goal, in both
Mm.
cases, extinction is present in the conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
And then what extinction would mean is that you are okay for this place to be devoid of either life or humanity, depending on what kind of antinatalist you are.
Yeah.
So if you're okay with that, then would you be okay if, and I'm talking about the instant vanishing variation of the red button here,
Mm.
would you be okay if instantly everybody vanishes and there's no physical or mental suffering happening because nobody knows that they're just going to go in an instant? So it comes through an extinction route. That's one I can think of. The other
Yeah.
route, of course, is negative utilitarian route, that if you just want to
Yeah.
avoid all the suffering, okay, prevent all the suffering of create by not creating new beings, but the existing beings are still going to suffer in their rest of the life.
Mm.
So if you use this vanish variant experience, vanish variation of red button, you still avoid that rest of the suffering. Now it depends on whether you consider that suffering or saving of that suffering outweighing the other values like
Mm.
autonomy and rights and preferences and so on. So it depends. The answer depends on what your preferences are. And the third route I can think of is if you're a sentiocentric antinatalist.
Yeah.
where you're saying that it would be better if there is no sentient being existing on this earth. And this also ties into your alternative where you are comparing earth and Mars. So I
Mm.
know there you are suggesting only the comparison, but that sort of raises a question like, okay, you are proposing this, but how are you going to achieve this Mars state on the earth?
Yes, but I think so. That question about how are you going to achieve, I don't think that's part of antinatalism, right? Antinatalism is just an it's an ethical position on something, but how are you actually going to realize that is a separate question, right? So um, if we, for example, I don't know, anti-slavery, right? If you ask the vast majority, if you ask everyone, the vast majority of people say yes, I'm ethically against slavery, right? But just because they're ethically against slavery hasn't committed them to also being for some specific route towards that, right? Like that's a separate question, the actual route towards it. Now it will be informed by their opposition to slavery, but I don't think being opposed to something on ethical grounds necessarily means that as part of that, there's a roadmap laid out on how to get there, right? I think the roadmap has to be layered on top of the ethical position, but it's not part of the ethical position itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I sort of agree. I was just saying where this red button
Right, where it comes
comes
from.
up, right?
Yeah.
It comes from this question like how the first thing is, okay, if we
Yes.
turn to Mars instantaneously, what happens? And then how?
Well, no, but that's not it's not about if we turn to Mars instantaneously. It's comparing, right? It's
Yeah,
comparing the two states.
that's
Um,
that's the first statement. Yeah, and then this is a
yeah.
different statement. There's a leap in between.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
I get that.
And and also I wanted to say a quick bit on the extinction and the negative utilitarianism. So obviously I know you're just presenting these as ways that people might be getting to the red button from
Yeah,
antinatalism, right? So I'm not saying this in response to you. I'm saying it in response to the point.
yeah,
So the first one about extinction is yes, bar some sort of radical life extending technology, antinatalism in with the negative duties that come from that of not procreating will result in extinction, right? But and I think this is widely recognized in antinatalist circles. There are different forms of extinction. Obviously, there's dying out extinction, but there's also killing off extinction, right? And those are two very different things. Antinatalism will only lead to dying out extinction. The red button deals with killing off extinction, and those are two very very different things. So I understand why people see antinatalism, they see extinction, they see the red button, and they lump them all together. But I just wanted to pass those two things out very quickly. On the negative utilitarianism, I understand that for many people negative utilitarianism and antinatalism intersect, but they aren't obviously the same thing. So you can get to an antinatalist conclusion using negative utilitarian logic, but just because you can get to both antinatalism and the red button using negative utilitarian logic doesn't mean that the red button and antinatalism are necessarily linked. They're just stemming from the same core set of principles, if that makes sense. So
yeah.
that's what I say on each of those three.
Right. I also, I actually want to come to the part where you say antinatalism is not the end state ideology.
Right. Yeah.
But before that, and I might be repeating myself, but just want to make it clear that, David Benatar talks a lot about death, whether it
Mm,
is in Better Never to Have Been or whether it is in the human predicament, he talks about death even more. And that's death of an individual. And then you get into scenarios of how that death happens, the process of dying, which one of the options of process of dying would be dying instantaneously.
mm.
That is also addressed in the human predicament, and he says that is bad as well because of blah blah reasons, because it's annihilation
Annihilation. Yeah.
and preference frustration and so on. But my point is, it's addressed. Benatar is not responding to anybody. He himself has brought these points up in case of individual death.
Mm,
Now, in the same light, I would I would be very happy if he writes on red button. But
Yeah.
isn't that analogous that on an individual death, if you write so much, you can build up a case writing about red button on a species level or on a life level?
Do you mean a case for pushing it or a case for talking about it in the context of antinatalism?
So, in case of Benatar, he has opposed the individual death. He says death is bad.
Yeah.
Even if you kill somebody instantly, it is bad for that
Mm.
particular person, is what his
Yeah.
position is. Analogously, he can build a case that pushing the red button, even if it is instant vanishing, is still bad. And
Yeah, which I think he talks about in his recent interview with
with
George Martin, right?
yes, yeah, carnism debunked.
Yeah.
Correct. So yeah, that's his opinion. But my point is, in the case of human predicament and in the case of individual death, he has written
Mm.
it actively.
Oh, right. So you mean he is discussing? So if I'm understanding, what you're saying is he is discussing topics that aren't specifically antinatalism, but they're related. They are, seem to be related to it. And so if he's doing that, what's the harm in doing the same with the red button?
Yes.
Okay, so I think when David Benatar, yeah, and you probably know it better than me, so correct me where I'm wrong. When he discusses death, he I don't know if he says this explicitly, but it's sort of implicit in what he's saying is that this is a separate conversation to antinatalism. The only way, maybe not the only way, but the only way that's coming to my mind at the moment that death is related to antinatalism is that if you believe death is a harm, it's one of the harms included in the harms of coming into existence, right?
Yes.
So that is how that would relate. But apart from that, discussions on the ethics of death or the philosophy of death or however you want to put it, like obviously I think it's fine for antinatalists to discuss multiple um topics, right? So if someone wants to discuss antinatalism and death, then they can discuss those two things. Obviously, they're free to do that, but they just need to make sure that they're not causing any confusion that the two are linked, unless they make clear how they are linked. Like what I was just saying there, with death being a harm, blah blah blah. The same can be true of the red button. If Benatar wants to write an article on the red button, I see no issue with that. The only reason I see it as an issue is if he is writing it and conflating it with antinatalism, and this is one of the confusions I think people got in the comments responding to my video, is that I'm not saying for antinatalists to never discuss the red button. What I'm saying is, in conversations about antinatalism, it doesn't seem to be relevant to me, and so I think we should leave it by the wayside. And I would say the same to Benatar. Like, if he publishes an article on the red button, that's completely fine. It would be interesting. But if he's publishing on the red button and saying that that is part of antinatalism, then unless he lays out very good reasons, I'd then take issue with it. If that
Right.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we can go on, but I just want to move on to that, the end state
Yes.
part.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that antinatalism is not an end state ideology,
Yeah.
right? But if you look at Benatar, I'm coming back to Benatar, even Mati,
Yeah.
but let's look at Benatar first. So in Better Never to Have Been, there's a whole chapter dedicated for extinction, population and extinction,
Yeah.
right? And if you look at some snippets, and I have them, I would put them on the screen. He says, while talking about population, the central question of population is how many people should there be? And my answer to this question is zero. And in another place, he says, here he's talking about the cumulative number of humans that have existed and that will exist in future. And in that context, he says many might wish to focus on a question of how many more people there may be in the cumulative sense rather
Mm.
than at some specified time in future. And the ideal answer here again is zero. This to me, at least I to me it seems like he is in some way addressing the end state, if not prescribing how the end state should be.
So I think there's a difference when you're discussing it when you're discussing extinction as part of antinatalism. There's a difference between it being a consequence and a goal, right?
Mhm.
So someone may be an antinatalist and an extinctionist. And to be honest, for anyone watching, because I know I personally have friends who I think maybe find my position on this annoying, and I do understand, because I think it is very nitpicky, and it's almost a distinction without a difference, or a difference without distinction, however you put it. But um, I think there is a philosophical difference between extinction being a goal, or a part of antinatalism, and it being a consequence. Um, and I think, I mean, I would have to go back and read Better Never to Have Been again to get the full context of these quotes.
Mhm.
But those quotes to me seem completely in line with Benatar talking about extinction as a consequence of antinatalism, right?
Yeah.
And I know that in his book, he does explicitly say that a killing off extinction, which would also achieve, a zero future people,
Yes.
is bad, and he's against that.
Yeah.
So that would make me think that he's talking more about a dying off extinction, which is more a consequence of antinatalism, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. I actually don't. I mean, we can get back on after both of us go through that chapter 6 again, because
Yeah.
there's a lot to digest there. But I don't think, at least as far as that chapter is concerned, he's talking or he's addressing extinction only as a consequence.
Right.
But even then, let's, for the sake of argument, accept that we take it as a consequence. I think
Mm.
that consequence should still be addressed seriously.
Yeah, no, I agree, because I think it's like, when I mean, maybe it's not directly analogous, but when, if we're talking about veganism, people say, oh well, if we all became vegan, then the animals would just be overtake the earth, blah blah blah, right? So even though obviously that is a lot more stupid than someone's concern about, if we're all stop having children, then we'll go extinct, because that will happen, whereas animals aren't overrunning the earth, that wouldn't obviously happen. But the fact that people bring these up, I agree. We should deal with them. We should talk about them. Um, I just don't know how, if we're going back to the red button, how the red button would contribute to that discussion. Because again, when people bring up extinction with antinatalism, especially in this context, they would be talking about dying off extinction rather than killing off extinction.
Right, right, right. I just want to, since you brought up veganism, that was another point in
Yeah.
that document. If you if you can see, uh,
Yes.
I say this because I'm going to flash these snapshots
Yeah. Yeah.
on the video so that people can see. So this website Viva, it seems to be an animal welfare or animal rights. I don't know, some website which is concerned
They're
about animals.
Yeah, they're one of the biggest animal organisations in the UK. They're based out of Bristol. They're very active in the UK. So yeah, I know
Right,
them.
right. And they have this article, do vegans want farmed animals to go extinct? And if you scroll down, so on the next page, they actually talk about these creatures which are bred by us for as farmed animals, they will go extinct. And they say, then so be it, that is okay. But before that, they also answer just the sentence before that paragraph, they already answer the prospective question, a red button equivalent question in this case. That they
Yeah.
say that that is not to say we ought to exterminate these animals, quite the contrary. So my point is, red button experiment or equivalent arguments are
Mm.
brought in the scenarios of other problems when the problems are stretched at a universal level.
Yeah. Well, kind of. I don't think so in this case, right? Because they're preemptively saying this is not what we mean, right? They're
Yeah.
not. They're not writing an article saying, if there was this hypothetical red button that we could push and it would end all lives on Earth, so therefore there would be no more animals exploited. That's not something that they're like, because, and they're, in fact, they're explicitly saying the opposite. They're saying we're not talking about killing animals off. We're talking about simply, essentially, ceasing to procreate, but procreate the animals, and then they die off. And so I think, personally, and I don't know if I'm just twisting this in my head to be convenient, but personally I think they're saying the exact same thing that I was saying in the video.
They are preventing the red button scenario to be asked in the first place. Is that what I'm?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, they're
Yeah, could be.
preemptively bringing it up so someone doesn't bring up this hypothetical, yeah.
Red button. Yeah, that also is one way to look at it. Yeah, I agree. But
Convenient for me.
now, but the point I wanted to make was that the problems that you had presented in the video, like sex
Mm,
trafficking or other problems, they were relatively local problems in the sense of antinatalism is probably one of the biggest universal problems or universal solutions, the way you look at it. I can't think anything bigger than, you know, no being there, anything bigger than no life being there. Um,
Well, remember, antinatalism is specifically about not coming into existence.
mhm.
So if antinatalism were to be realized, it would simply mean that there are no more beings coming into it. Well, it depends on your definition of antinatalism, but it would mean that there are no more, at least on the minimal level that all antinatalists agree on, it would mean that there are no moral agents bringing any beings into existence anymore, right? So, and that would achieve an antinatalist world if we restrict it to the core bit of antinatalism we all agree on. But there would still be beings in existence.
Yeah.
So it's, you've turned off the tap, but there's still water in the bath kind of thing. And someone could say that turning off the tap is the biggest bit to do, but that would realize antinatalism, but that wouldn't solve. And again, it depends on your ethical worldview. But if you view beings continuing being in existence, especially if they're ones that suffer a lot and don't have moral agency, then you would still see a moral issue with there being, existence. So it, I don't think it's as universal as. So I think that you're prescribing it as universal, but that's because you're lumping together the very things that I was saying we should separate. If you get
Uh,
what I mean.
yeah, no, I just want to give a little clarification. If
Yeah.
I remember, this was like years ago when Amanda was interviewing David Panetta, and she
Mm,
said, "This is the biggest issue in the universe." And Panetta said, "What do you mean? I don't think this is the biggest issue." And what I think what she meant at the time, and what I also mean here, is that we should not bring new beings into existence, even if the
mm,
consequence of that is eventually we'll have a world where no life is there or no sentient life is there.
mm.
That's the statement, but the underlying to that is that because it would how do I word it, it would have been better had we not come into existence,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
the beings which are existing today, we are saying that it would have been better had they also not come into existence.
Yes.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but we have to remember as well that, because you were saying, if we stop bringing new beings into existence, then it will lead to a universe where there's no sentient beings anymore. But that's actually not the case, because most of the sentient beings that come into existence aren't brought into existence by us, right? So we bring humans into existence and domesticated animals, but we don't bring wild animals into existence. So if we define antinatalism as not bringing new sentient beings into existence, then it there would still be sentient beings coming into existence. And there would be, you'd need a further step to say we should intervene. Right now, this gets into tricky territory, because some people say that intervening in the lives of others is part of antinatalism, and some people say it isn't. Personally, I don't think it is. That's not to say it's wrong. I personally do think we should intervene in the wild and help wild animals. I just think it's separate from antinatalism, which I've said before in other
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah.
So,
But
yeah.
that is not my point. I can say coming into sentient existence is harmful, right? Whether
Yeah.
whoever is bringing them into
Yes.
existence,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
right? And in that sense, then it includes the future beings as well as the beings who have come into existence, and
Yes.
therefore it encompasses the entire sentient universe.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah.
In that sense, I meant universal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I agree, and in that sense, I'm exactly the same as you. But I think to fully get to antinatalism, as I think most people understand it, I think that's an important part. But another important part is then the negative duty that comes from that of I should not be bringing any new sentient beings into existence.